Sam, are you going to take them?
I'm going to be taking them to the farm at the weekend, so they won't be here from next week. It was just something that, you know, I looked at my calendar and I looked at my home personal calendar and thought, yeah, we can do that. I did not think that the chicks would just suddenly hatch. So that's the only other thing I can suggest is if you want.
Right, so just be silent a little bit. Right, so I can see whether I can take that bit of sound, pitch noise or whatever, and that should take it out right across the vocal. If we speak gently, and then we say, with my back and my screen and you with your chicks. Good evening, Sam, and how are you today?
Yes, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm very good. Or should I say Dr. Sam?
I do get called Dr. Sam a lot, actually, distinguishing me from the other Sams that I work with, but Sam's just fine.
Brilliant. And the audience will notice that we've got to speak quietly because you have some friends with you today.
I do, yes. I've just hatched 7 bantam chicks today. They're a day early, so I expected that it would be quite quiet in the study this evening, but they had other ideas, so they're cheeping away in the background, so apologies for
Brilliant.
that.
I've never interviewed chicks before in the background, so this is the first for us both, yeah? So, Sam, we have met physically in real life. I don't meet many of my podcasters, but we've met in real life. We met last week at the conference, and you've done an amazing presentation, which we're going to hear about shortly. But I've seen your presentation before as well on an EnCO training course, and obviously today is all about EnCO as well. So for the benefit of our audience, can you give us some background to yourself and you know what you've been doing over the last couple of years regarding this?
Absolutely. So try and be brief. It's a bit of a saga. But after graduating in my early 20s doing chemistry, I thought that I'd always been particularly passionate about sustainability and climate change, energy-related things. One of my top dreams was to have an electric car when I was only about 10 years old. I used to do a lot of litter picks and things like that. But after a few years of doing sort of climate change activism work with youth groups, political groups, intergenerational justice things in the political area with the UNFCCC and climate change negotiations, I sort of thought it wasn't really my bag just talking about CO2 emissions and polar bears and ice caps and things. It wasn't really getting the attention of politicians and things. So I decided that I was going to retrain in energy management and that it would be a lot better. I would get to the end goal of reducing emissions if we talked about the bottom line. So I decided to look for some kind of engineering degree and do something to do with energy management. And at the time, the engineering doctorate had just come out. So this ENGD program was an energy or sustainability related problem that was identified within industry by a sponsoring company. And then they take the project out to different universities almost to sort of tender it, depending on whatever experts that they had in-house. So I was interviewed at Reading University by Mitchells and Butlers PLC, which were the largest pub operating company at the time. So they had almost 2,000 restaurants, 17 different brands, 40,000 employees, absolutely massive energy consumption, with a lot of interesting problems. And they really wanted somebody to look at the future of catering an energy reduction in the food service sector over sort of 10, 20 years, and what the future might hold for energy prices and how they were going to reduce it specifically from the catering side of things rather than the whole building. So I was completely fresh-faced. They deliberately said that they chose someone who'd never worked in waitressing or ever done any kind of chefing at all, that weren't sort of corrupted by the we've always done it this way, so we're always going to do it this way attitude. So they got me completely no experience at all, just a chemist. And then over 7 years, I'd completed 10 master's modules, from sort of climate change stuff to energy and buildings, and everything in between, really. It was very, very wide ranging, and then spent 75% of the time with the company. And the project itself was hugely well received. I was quite lucky. It was very PR friendly. There's a lot of pictures of burgers and beers and things, compared with some of my friends doing U values of glazing and different types of concrete and things, which could have been quite dry in some areas. So I always got rolled out of conferences to talk about kitchens and pubs and booze and things. Yeah, it was all over the place, from energy benchmarking to publishing new figures and statistics on what the sector sort of really consumed, to developing a sophisticated model for modeling menus and energy reduction depending on different cooking appliances, different meals that they served, and then a massive behavior change project in between as well.
And did it cover the whole spectrum of their business?
I'd say so, really, given that sort of, food service was the #1 priority. I mean, big companies like that are essentially property companies, especially Mitchells and Butlers. They own most of their properties. Right. So obviously anything to improve the energy consumption and the decks and things at the time were all absolutely critical to the business. For me, as I said, they were quite keen that I focus on the catering operation, and a lot of the reason why they approached me was because genuinely nothing had been done at the time. So it started in 2011, which is longer ago than I like to admit now, but they just couldn't find anything. So even the head of energy, environment and sustainability at the time, Richard Felgate, he said that, he'd had a look. CIBSE had developed a TM50, which was the energy efficiency in commercial kitchens. But when you start to look through it, and it's got a few good ideas, they're quite generic. Perhaps change your freezer and get a more efficient freezer, change your char grill for a more efficient char grill, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Even the sort of energy benchmarks that they had in the publication, when I tracked down, I looked at the references, and that said it came from a book from 1998. I thought that was quite a long time ago. And I found that book, and then that said that they hadn't produced the data, that it had come from a book from 1989. So then I got the British Library involved. Where's this book from 1989? Got that 1978. And I stopped at that point, and it looked like every single publication had just taken this previous data on what pubs or restaurants should use in terms of energy benchmarks, from sort of kilowatt hours of gas per meter squared or whatever, and none of it had been updated for 4 decades. And you think about how much pubs have changed since then, from the sort of wet-led boozer to these really quite fancy restaurants, are all quite food-led, and duty on alcohol has changed so much. So the very first thing that I had to do was go and actually assess it, using a load of CIBSE methodology, and I actually had them update their benchmarks in the end with the new data that I managed to provide for them.
So you created your own benchmark, basically, going forward.
So that was pretty much the first thing that I did. I worked with an amazing team of people, not just at Mitchells and Butlers, but also a group called Carbon Statements that are now the Hospitality Net Zero Forum. So they had got a lot of data on other multi-brand large pub and restaurant operators, and then I obviously had Mitchells and Butlers, which was almost 2,000 at the time, and every site that had AMR data was shoved into my database. And the very first paper that I published was just assessing all of it in terms of what the best, most reliable metric to use was. That was one of the first questions. I thought, how can this, stumble at the first hurdle like that? But almost all the other buildings that are in the sort of TM22 benchmarks were kilowatt hours per meter squared. But it didn't matter how I cut the data. It didn't give a decent relationship. Any pub of any size could seemingly use a random amount of energy use. So I got some people who are a little bit better at maths than me to run it through a statistical program and show me how to use it all. And I ended up making a multilinear regression model and using every bit of data that I had from food numbers of meals, noms we say in the business, nods for number of drinks, the meter squared, meter cubed, so the area, the volume of the building, you know, tall ceilings and that kind of thing, opening hours, number of patio heaters, absolutely anything that I could find against electricity and gas usage to try and tease out some kind of model of whether or not a pub was using sort of the average amount of energy use compared with someone that was using way too much given those metrics, or somebody who should be technically sort of rewarded, pat on the back and a visit to see how are you still producing this amount of food turnover but using such a low amount of energy use. So it was really sort of data driven at the time, this massive modeling exercise, just to look at whether or not we could predict a reward, or for a better word, punish certain sites that were using far in excess of the average. And in the end, that data set was over 20,000 pubs. It was more than half of the British managed estate of restaurants. So obviously that was hugely valuable to CIBSE to be able to have that data. So I anonymized it and then provided it to them to do with what they will. And actually, the paper itself won their annual award. I think it was called the most valuable contribution to the art and science of building service engineering. So I got
That's
that.
Amazing. That's amazing.
I was just, like I said, I'd like to say that it was all my good work, but first of all, it's a fantastic team. Secondly, it was a great data set. And finally, it was just, they desperately needed someone to do something like that. This sector had been completely overlooked, and even more crazy to add further weight to it, when the sort of introductory paragraphs of my thesis, when it was finally written in 2016, the catering sector uses double the energy consumption of the rest of the food chain. And I couldn't quite get my head around that. So it's equivalent to agriculture and food retail. And it had just been completely overlooked. 24 terawatt hours a year. And that was when I looked in 2015. So you think about all of the energy consumption from growing the food, processing the food, getting it through supermarkets and through retail. That chunk at the end, commercial food service preparation, is the same amount as the rest of the food chain. And there was nobody studying it. And still to this day, I'm unaware of any PhD, masters, any academic research, just what our team had done.
Yeah. Let's go back a little bit. And first of all, you was like this climate change activist that was trying this, to approach the government and lobby the government, etc. And then you've gone to the other side, basically, where you can make a difference. How did that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I think I have the best job in the world. Like I really do. Every day I get up and I feel like I'm saving the world. I tell myself,
amazing, yeah.
Able to get out of bed. That is what I tell myself to get dressed in the morning. But really, it was, I was younger and I was a bit more optimistic at the time. So I thought that being in the sort of youth climate movement was one of the best places for me. And I was certainly doing a lot of voluntary work to beef up my CV, because I knew I was going for a career change pretty early. I'd only worked in chemistry for 3 years, I think. And I thought I need to get as much experience as possible. And I fell in with an amazing crowd at UK YCC, the UK Youth Climate Coalition. And one of their unbelievable USPs was that they had managed to get a member of the organisation to the UN FCCC's climate negotiations every year. So I think it started in, I want to say COP18, 19. So they started to send a delegate to be the British Youth Climate delegate, so the British youth delegate to the UN. And then I was fortunate enough to do that in Cancun, the intersessionals in Bonn in 2010. Yes. So so I managed to actually get into the negotiations and even pose a question to Cristina Figueres, the UN Secretary for Climate Change negotiations at the time. So that really set the scene quite early. So, well, I've already been to the UN at this point. What should I do now? But it really impacted me, where I felt like it was an awful lot of arguing and making no progress. And I felt quite disillusioned after that. And especially my local sort of Tory heartland round here, that were trying to engage with a lot of politicians that genuinely had a lot of money in oil and gas and aviation. I thought, I cannot keep barking up that tree. And the more I would talk about money and the savings to be had, the more people started listening. And I thought, yeah, I think I'm going to have to leave the emissions side of things and go for the financial and
that's interesting. Yeah,
things.
that's an interesting point. I like that, because I'm finding that as well. People will, they're not interested in us saving the planet, but they're interested in us saving their pockets, which is very key, especially at the moment.
Yes, definitely. And my goodness, particularly in the hospitality sector at the moment, they are on their absolute knees. Exactly. And sadly, they were even before COVID, really, between sort of labour shortages, stock shortages, delivery problems, supply chain issues, Brexit, and then coronavirus. So that was really the last kick in.
And now the energy crisis that's hitting us.
Now this has happened.
We've seen energy prices rise 180% recently on some of our hospitality clients that we've been looking at.
Absolutely. And with all of the sort of credit rating issues over COVID, I've heard of quite a few that are just being refused supply at the moment. So they just can't get energy contracts. It's absolutely dire. One client I have that only had 3 pubs. Their bill was £80,000 a year. So, I mean, they really do use more than the supermarket, most sort of average pub companies. And yeah, £80,000 a year from 3 sites shot up to £230,000, and that's just completely unsustainable. I mean, to the point where they will have to close. They can't pay that bill on their knees recovering from COVID. And I genuinely believe that they don't have very many controllable costs, sort of labour, minimum wage increases. There's nothing really they can do about that. Supply chain, not much they can do about that. But energy is their number one controllable cost. And for these types of businesses, it's often the second or third largest cost after labour and food and drink. It's energy.
That's my favourite saying. After their people and the property comes the energy cost. So, absolutely. Sam, the actual process you went through regarding the savings, I'm guessing that it's purely behavioral pattern sort of approach. There was no technology involved regarding the LED lighting or technology, or was there?
Not for the majority of the thesis, actually. So it broke down into about, 5 chapters? The first one was the benchmarking stuff that I mentioned. So that was just, how am I going to measure that there's been progress? So a lot of sort of data and statistics was the first part. The next part was a massive energy monitoring year or so. So yeah, it was about 1.5 years. So I had AMR data already, but we decided, the team at M&B, to really granularly monitor absolutely everything, monitor the hell out of 14 businesses. So most of them were sort of a classic rural pub chain. Some of them were grill led, like a Harvester, and two Toby Carvery type businesses. So we monitored all that, and then that set us up as a really good test bed for starting to look at the possibility of upgrading certain appliances and doing things differently, because we had all the monitoring there. But then I moved on to writing that up. So my second paper was electricity use in the commercial kitchen, and the most striking part of watching these kitchens for 1 year or so was the behavior, which was also the difficulty that I had with the AMR data in the first place. It was so difficult to get anything to match up or predict energy use. And I knew it was because the behavior was so poor from an energy point of view that you just couldn't see anything else under it. You could change this or you could change that, but really it was about everybody turning stuff on as soon as they get in the morning and leaving it on until they leave. So I realized in the sort of second of 5 years, the largest scope for savings was behavior change. And that paper, actually, one of the most striking results was in a salamander grill. So the sort of over-fire cheese melter type grill where you might put a steak and cheese sandwich on a tray and it will be melted from above. And with that, the average consumption was something like 50 kilowatt hours a day, 49, I think it was, average from the 14 kitchens that we looked at. And they would typically go on at sort of 8-9 o'clock in the morning. They'd be switched on, they'd be left on maximum all day, because don't get me wrong, guest satisfaction and getting the food out the door is the number one priority. So everything goes on. It's a terrible environment to work in as well in terms of thermal comfort. It's absolutely freezing and boiling at the same time, really. So everything goes on straight away, left on maximum, flat on all day, and then turned off at 10 at night before they go home. And then after mentioning to one particularly keen chef, we're actually watching what you're doing here. We've got all of your energy data coming straight to my my laptop every day. Do you think that you could be as energy thrift as possible? Can you turn it on as late as possible? Perhaps turn it down when you're not using it, or turn it off between the sort of lull of lunch and dinner, and then turn it off as soon as you can. And bless him, that guy got it down to something like 14 kilowatt hours. So in today's money, it was basically £19.60 for the average behavior, and down to £5.60 for the chef that was trying as hard as possible. And scale, that's one day. That is one day's usage. So scaling that up to a year, and then scaling that up for 1,800 sites, £9 million. £9 million of savings. And that's one of the main operators. Obviously, you've got Green King and Wetherspoons and Marsdens and Fullers and all these other massive pub chains that are suffering from the same problem, because they have a very transient workforce. They have a group of people that might, if they get trained on this kind of thing, they might be gone in 3 or 4 months. So it was quite an uphill battle at the start, anyway, to get the board to invest in staff training and a behavior change campaign, because it didn't really feel like it would be a long-term high return project for them at the time. But we definitely turns that attitude around quite quickly.
How did you, so you found a good chef, how did you then spread that word of that? How do you multiply him? Was it easy, or was that your challenge?
It still is my challenge, because, as I said, it's not the number one concern for most people. It is making sure that the appliances are doing what they need to do and getting the sort of high throughput of food out the door as soon as they can. But first of all, I work with some amazing people. So the very initial study on this grill, I'm just going to have a look at what you're doing, and I'm writing it up for my thesis. Richard Felgate took that straight to the board, and it was very, very convincing numbers. So he knew that it would be able to get some buy-in at that point. And then another chap that I worked with for 7 years or so, Martin Schwaller, he was on the board of the EMA looking at behaviour change, to the Energy Managers Association at the time as well. So he was very, very invested in sort of personality theories and gamification of things. We also had Jim Sharman, who I work with now, who liked to look at the numbers and come up with sort of these graphs in the background. So between us, we've managed to get all of the numbers and all of the tips and all the sort of workshops and games together to start rolling out large workshops and a big behavior change competition and an ideas competition within a year or so, and save about 20%. So for them at the time, it was about £100,000 in a couple of months for a very, very small initial sort of cost of the prizes, things like iPads and days out and parking permits and a few other really, really interesting little bits that we managed to do. So it was hard to get a lot of people's buy-in at the start, but I definitely saw some amazing things happen from people just printing out the graphs that they were given every week and sticking them up in the staff room, and you could observe people going up to it and having a look. Oh, have we done this week compared with the last 4 weeks, compared with this time last year, their lowest consumption overnight or pre-trade, and always trying to get to that lowest bit, and having a competition with other brands nearby in the same district, or the rest of the brand, or just their local area, or whatever it was. So yeah, we managed to freshen it up quite a lot to try and keep the momentum going, by focusing on different appliances. So maybe the first fortnight looking at the grill, the next fortnight looking at lighting, the next fortnight looking at sort of the bar area, coffee machines, bottle fridges, this kind of stuff, and trying to change it up, because I think one of the initial attitudes was that behavior change doesn't last, and you need to, things like stickers and posters need to change frequently to keep people's interest.
Did you introduce a raspberry and a chocolate at one time?
Yes, so yeah, that's right. So I think one of the most important things in a sort of a multi-site business like this, is quite a complex business like these, is that there's so many other people that have an influence on energy consumption. That's not just the chefs or the front of house staff, or even just the procurement in the office, the head office that specify all the equipment. You've got cleaners that come in the morning. They're the ones that turn the lights on, and they're often told, or perhaps they're contract cleaners that might not be part of the business, so they don't really have much of an incentive to turn the lights off when they go home, if they're doing it sort of 4 a.m. or something in the winter. So trying to engage others like security staff and cleaners was something that the team were quite keen to do. And there's a really, really tricky balance between sort of shaming people, because that's the sort of climate activist world that I grew up in, is you shouldn't be doing this, think of the children, and the congratulating people for the baby steps that they do. And one of the really cool things that one of my colleagues came up with was the raspberry and coal approach. So the security staff in the head office were sort of empowered to decide whether or not people were going to get chocolates put on their keyboards overnight when they'd left the building, or raspberries or pieces of coal for leaving their computers on overnight. So that was sort of a tongue-in-cheek shaming thing, I suppose. But it also worked really well, because we weren't really explicit with the rules at the time. So it wasn't turn your computer off and you will win a reward. The idea was to get people talking and try and suss out what was happening. So why have I got a raspberry on my desk? Oh, you've got some chocolate. What have you done? And it just sort of started a water cooler type conversation about it. And let's see if people could work it out over a period of a few weeks. It was the same kind of thing for on the spot rewards. So we had a number of energy auditors that went out to the businesses to give training and support to sites that were underperforming using that benchmark metric. So even if they were really busy, or they were really big, or they were open longer, if this model, this equation came out and said, actually, this is way above average, they'd get a visit. Or perhaps if they were really low, way under average, they would also get a visit as well to see what we could learn. And the energy auditors would have a bottle of wine or a couple of boxes of Quality Street on hand to just give immediate rewards when they saw, oh, your time clock's been changed and the British summertime is all up to date. Here you go, have this. And that got people thinking, oh, I wonder what I can get if I do this.
So we was doing all this process, the level of savings, the amount of time that was invested in it, and your time, etc. There's a cost to all of that. What is the payback of all of this cost as such? Did you ever put figures on that?
I did, yes. So with the behaviour change campaign, it was quite specifically, we got investment of £25,000, which sounds like quite a lot for prizes, but it really quickly added up between the different types of competitions we were doing. So within this annual competition, lasted 12 months, there were 3 or 4 competitions that lasted 3 or 4 months for overnight savings reductions, daily savings reductions, comparison to last year, pre-trade, overnight, all these kinds of things. Also the competitions between brands and between districts and head office and head office floors, and all those kinds of things were quite, and then per brand for a company with sort of 15, 17 brands at the time, even if you just had one iPad for 700 quid, it quite quickly added up in terms of the prizes. But as I said, the savings are absolutely staggering. So the example I gave on the grill, that was a 71% reduction from the grill, which when you scale that up in today's money, and obviously prices were quite different then actually. We're looking back over it recently, I realized it was like something like 12p per kilowatt for electric at the time. But in today's money, that's £9 million worth of savings just from that grill. So the paybacks that I've had a look at overall is 90 million kilowatt hour savings, which was 100 grand in 3 months, 10 million pounds over a year. So the return on that was immediate. It was within weeks. So it was the highest return on investment campaign project that the company had seen. And obviously I get that in a pub, especially M&B had one of the longest operating pubs in the country at the time. You have to do things like replace carpets and paint it and get a new bar and get new stalls and things. But I don't really know how they work out the return on investment of sort of decorating projects and things. But energy, my goodness, some of this stuff is absolutely mad. LED lighting at the company that paid back in 2.5 months.
Wow. That's
next time you go into a restaurant, count the number of light bulbs. It's absolutely insane. There's all behind the bar and all in the bottle fridges and all of the spotlights and the pendants and the fancy sort of cage, galvanized steel cages that some of them have. And there's a lot of light bulbs in these establishments. So changing from old tungsten bulbs and even the old energy saving ones for LEDs, very, very expensive, but it returns very, very quickly. And I think really now to look at the sector and think there's a lot that they could do, because bless them, it's not been the easiest sector to change. They've done things the way that they've done for decades, hundreds of years, really. A lot of these things, an oven is a heated uninsulated box that's basically stayed the same for 100 years. So there's a lot of technological work, but actually for a sector that's got no capital, they've got no money at all, you can't go in with a let's do the LEDs. It's low hanging fruit because it costs £1 million to upgrade an estate like that. But a behavior change campaign that's well thought out with decent incentives and are well matched for the sort of culture and the generation theory and the personality types and all the rest, it could pay back immediately for a really small investment. So actually, I'd say it's the number one thing to look at.
And has your case study been put forward now onto the EnCO case studies now?
Yes, yeah. So I was very privileged and honoured to get their practitioner status for it just last week. It should be on the website in the next week or so, I believe.
And the thesis that you wrote, the documentation, is that available now to people to download, or can they get in there?
I own the IP on it, so I can provide it to anybody. The papers themselves are only really downloadable from academic databases, but I have, as author, I have uploaded them on my own website fairly recently, actually, in the last year or so, and some of them are sort of 5 years old now. But I think one of the most important things, which isn't really covered in the EnCO side of things, but all of these learnings for behaviour and what pub companies sort of should use in inverted commas, that was all the first half of the thesis. So the second half was all about cooking practices, and obviously behaviours ingrained in all of that, but how you can tease out what the lowest energy template kitchen should be given a menu, which was a lot more complex than I thought it was going to be at the time, which it took more than 50% of the time and the effort of the project was all building a model to look at what they cook and how they cook it. And I've recently put that on my website because I feel like it's so important for not just the sector as one of the first things that they could do to survive these difficult times, but also for the planet. As the activist in me, it's almost criminal sometimes, the amount of energy being used when it doesn't have to be. You might think it does because of the really busy periods that all sort of pubs and restaurants go through, from Christmas and Mother's Day and even Halloween actually seems to be quite a money maker. They have a perception that they need 4 combi ovens because of when it's really busy. But this sort of tool that I developed was to try to get them to specify their kitchens a bit more appropriately for the food that they actually sell and save hundreds of thousands of pounds a year on that basis.
And is that at chef level or head office level?
It's both, really, because as I said, one of the main things that I got from the initial energy monitoring exercise was this behavior thing. So that grill stood out, 70% savings just for better behavior management in this grill. But one of the other aspects was specification. So of those 14 restaurants, several of them had four combi ovens. So microwave steam combi ovens, and they do the bulk of the work. So they might do the pies and things like that. Most of them had four, but energy data tells quite a lot more than just how much energy they're using. You can see every time the oven is used by the peak. So you've got sort of a standard energy use, maybe 3,000 watts are being drawn a second for just keeping the box warm. But every time they open the door and the thermostat detects the cold air rushing in, it will peak. So you can see the peaks are when food has been put in and it's been programmed. But when you watch them all the time, like I do in my exciting life, you can see that all four of them are on, but only two of them are ever used. So in some ways,
if I remember rightly as well, they've got like a button on them for standby, haven't they?
Yes, some of them do. So it's quite old models at the time, but I've seen some sort of rationale. Other models are available, but I've seen some rationale ovens recently that you can almost use your phone. They use sort of Internet of Things technology, and you can just do a push button. But that's when the model sort of came down and showed the results. Moving away from something like a gas-fired char grill into a combi oven, really, really high efficiency, expensive combi oven, I must say, they not only did they save 50% of the energy use, but they also produced a sort of more consistent product as well. And they're also beneficial for chefs where English might not be their first language, because it's literally a picture. So a picture of a pie, press that, and all the pies come out the same. So loads of other co-benefits that aren't just energy savings to be had from moving to sort of more modern kit.
For the benefit of the audience today, can you share your website just verbally, and we download it as part of the...
Yes, it's the Mudie Method, themudiemethod.co.uk, but I'll certainly send you a link to that.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
And then let's talk about sorry, Gordon, but the Gordon Ramsays of this world. I had visions of you having these. I've done some work in restaurants where I've had arguments. It hasn't been a very nice place to be, because I'm trying to get them to manage. The worst thing for me is the grills, like the rings as such, where you go in. I had a famous story where I went into this hotel and he had all four rings on, and the chef was screaming at the facilities or the maintenance guy saying, "We need air conditioning. I need it now." And I said, "You've got all your four rings are on and you're not doing no cooking." I said, "Let me help you with your air conditioning." So I turned them off. I thought I was going to die, but I turned them off, and then the temperature started to drop for some strange reason.
Yes.
But he was insistent. He needed air conditioning.
Yes, and I've had exactly that conversation many times. God forbid you try to take the gas hob away from them completely, which is what I was trying to do with my model. I've actually had a couple of kitchens. Things have changed a lot in the last few years. But in the last couple of years since finishing my thesis, I've had a few operators contact me to go completely fossil fuel free, which I never would have imagined could have even possibly happened, sort of client led, 5 years, certainly definitely 10 years ago, because they love their gas to cook on. The sort of, and they like to put things like char grills right at the front of the kitchen as well. There's that real tendency to go for that sort of workhorse of the kitchen is on display, and people can see that it's real meat being cooked. But it's absolutely terrible to have the front of the kitchen removed. It's a nightmare for ventilation, and kitchen ventilation systems are one of the worst things in the kitchen for energy consumption. And then you've got the gas on top, and then you've got the fact that it's really radiative, so it's in your face and you're really hot. Yeah, there's a lot of problems with cooking on gas, but I'm starting to become quite optimistic that it will be phased out of this sector in the next decade or so.
Right.
And there's a lot of co-benefits to be had. So when I have these arguments about gas hobs and gas char grills, it's amazing how if you finally manage to break through and remove it, within weeks, saying, take that over my dead body. And then within weeks, they're saying, do you know what? This induction is amazing. It's easier to clean and nobody's quite as hot anymore. And it's more consistent. And if you just remove the pan from it, it just turns off on its own. And all of the rest of the stuff. And especially gas tends to like volatilize a lot of the fat deposits as well. So it's not just the surface that needs cleaning, it's the whole space around it gets a bit fatty with all the oils and things. And you just don't get that with the electric cooking. So that's a huge bonus that I'm hearing from people who have got the guts to remove it, or at least let me remove it.
So in Sam's world, is there a perfect kitchen that a hotel or a pub should have?
There is. So as I mentioned, this 2-year project to develop this tool was the Catering carbon calculator tool. And it was developed with the Carbon Trust and a lot of industry bodies, British Hospitality at the time, and the Catering Equipment and Distribution Supply Associations and CIBSE as well, and obviously Reading University, M&B, and quite a few others. So I think there were about 10 different organisations all working with me on this tool. And essentially it broke down what they were hoping to serve on an ingredient level basis. So everything in this tool took, say, a mixed grill, it would enter the parsley that was used to garnish it, the 100 grams of chips, the 50 grams of steak cutlets, the 200 grams of burger or whatever else was on it. And it would come up with the meal. And then it would take real sales data from the till downloads every half an hour slot. So it would say, how many of these mixed grills did you serve and when? And then at the back end, it would have all of the energy consuming appliances in the kitchen from the moment it arrived until the moment that it went out. So the walk-ins, the service and preparation fridges, anything like ware washing, ventilation, cutlery polishers, and then obviously everything to prepare the food from sort of prep and frozen and fresh, and then also the sort of heated gantries, bain-maries, keeping the food warm. So it took absolutely everything, and the kitchen ventilation as well, which was quite a challenge to get that in. And then it would essentially produce, this is what your kitchen uses per year, and it was validated against all the data that I got off all the monitoring for the first few years. Then it allowed me for the first time, and still the only time from what I'm aware of, to start to tweak it. So instead of going into a kitchen where it's basically impossible to run a proper trial, an academic trial on fresh versus frozen, if we move everything from frozen to fresh, what's that going to do to our energy consumption? We've never really been guided what should be frozen and what should be fresh, just really the cost and what we can get hold of from Breaks Brothers or whoever else. So I started to tweak the fresh and frozen mix. Then I started to look at the sort of operational decisions around whether or not they were going to cook to order or not, because an awful lot of cheaper family restaurants might order pies that have been prepared somewhere else, or at least the filling. So were they going to cook everything in the morning and then just hot hold it, or were they going to say get rid of all of the hot holding equipment and cook it all to order? How were they going to manage that kind of thing? So we started to look at a scenario for sort of cook on demand, or cook earlier and turn off all of the cooking appliances and just have the warming stuff on. And then the more radical things, which let's just get rid of the char grill, see what that does. And it worked it all out on a capacity basis. So it had sort of grams per minute that were going through all these appliances. So I had a number of checks on it to look at the utilization. So whether or not the char grill was being used, 50% of the area was being used, which actually incidentally identified a load of other problems. So things like the steamer, which can take a huge volume of carrot batons at the same time, was actually only used for 4% of its capacity. So they always have a steamer, which is always on and pressurized, but it was only used for 4% of what it could be.
Oh.
So then it would look at also the char grill was used 120% of its capacity on Sundays. So then you start to get in the mindset of the chef that's desperate to have everything on all the time and get the food out. But anyway, they at the end, I ran 7 different scenarios and wrote up all of the findings for that. And getting rid of the char grill completely, that was going to save £5 million worth of gas and a lot more emissions on top of that. And replacing it with 2 quite large Combi steam ovens, replacing electric fryers and gas fryers, replacing the gas hob with induction. And even that, again, they didn't really use the hob that much. They thought they did, and all 6 burners were burning all the time, but really it was just peas and eggs and some pasta. And you could get an electric pasta cooker and do peas in the microwave. Perhaps customers might not like to admit that peas can be done in the microwave, but that's how we do ours at home. So to start looking at all those things, and it saved the scenario that looked at all of these things combined. It saved 58% of the consumption of the kitchen. Now, each kitchen used about 250,000 kilowatt hours, about 28 grams worth of energy at the time. It'd be more like 50, 60 now per site. So scaled up over the case study chain, it was £2 million a year savings to make that switch. And again, this is in old money. So now it would be double that. It'd be about £4 million per year for that chain. But the interesting thing is, I looked at that chain of restaurants was 300 quite popular restaurants in the UK. If you scale it up to the 55,000 pub restaurants that there are, that's £1.5 billion a year off of that sector. So £1.5 billion worth of savings from switching 4 appliances. And the payback on that, they are very expensive. So of course I looked at that. They cost about £20,000 each, some of these char grills, so some of these combi ovens. But it paid back in 2.5 months. So the paybacks in these kinds of projects are always very attractive, but you do need quite a lot of capital up front. And actually, for a while, the energy technology list hasn't included a lot of these things, but that is changing now. So there's been a big consultation for the last 1.5 years that I've been part of on how to get combi ovens into sort of more attractive sort of tax back type.
What if we convert that monetary value into kilowatt hours and carbon? What's that figure? Do you know that?
I do. So at the time, it was 37 million kilowatt hours for that chain. I wonder what that is across the sector. So that was 300 sites. So that scaled up by 55,000 pubs. So I'm not actually sure what that is off the top of my head. And it
significant. It's a significant value, isn't it?
Significant value. It's about 11% of the UK service sector's energy consumption. The last time I checked, which was a couple of years ago, but it was 11% of the UK service sector energy consumption. And that's because despite catering buildings being overlooked, probably because of their complexity and difficulty around the sort of behaviour side of things, they're in every building, you know, from offices to Ministry of Defence, from schools, universities, hospitals, and then your actual cafes and your restaurants and things. They're a vital component of a low carbon town that really should be quite top priority. As I say, when you look at those benchmarks figures of kilowatt hours per metre squared, which is what sort of offices and supermarkets and theatres and everybody else are benchmarked by CIBSE, a restaurant uses more than 10 times what the average energy consumption of a service building is, or a retail building. So the numbers are absolutely staggering. So you can save 10 million kilograms of carbon through that one chain, multiply that by about 30,000, and that's what you've got for the sector. So it really is vast. There's an awful lot still to be done, and I'm definitely quite excited to be doing that.
I can't remember from your presentation, did you convert the carbon into something more relatable with the organisation?
Yes. And I've tried to do it a few times. This is the equivalent of taking a few million cars off of the road, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But specifically for your duty managers, the manager of each pub, it would be the equivalent of how many meals. So they care a lot about the covers, the number of people that you can fit in a restaurant at maximum capacity. And they always love to look at like-for-like sales, and rather than looking at the profit, which is what I try to get people to look at, they're always looking at sort of driving the number of meals that they can turn out the door. But something like switching a coffee machine off overnight for over a year is the equivalent of serving an additional 1,800 coffees. So when they get their heads around that, that is what's being wasted. And most people assume they can't turn the coffee machine off because they haven't for so long that it will break when they do it. But actually, even if it broke and you got a new one, as wasteful as that sounds, then you'd save enough money to buy about 400 coffee machines by the end of the year just from turning off the water boiler overnight. So trying to put it in terms of the number of meals or drinks that you could serve to gain that profit back, it's very compelling.
Yeah. So Sam, we've come to that stage of the podcast where I like to put my guest on the spot, and I sort of put you on the spot right at the beginning because I see your eyes go a bit funny. Oh dear. Is there anything you can give back to our industry today as a takeaway from your experience in this industry?
Well, specifically, I feel really lucky because, I mean, Mitchells and Butlers, the whole project and the team that I work with changed my life significantly by letting me play with their entire estate, really. But that sector find it really hard to share this information because it's so competitive and the project profit margins are so small. It is difficult for them to say, you know what, we tried this and it didn't work, and we tried this and it did, and start sharing that information. But I was lucky that they let me. So obviously I have these papers on my website. I will talk to anyone for free to get them to consider how they could save money and how we can keep the sector afloat. But certainly the whole team and the university sort of allowed me to champion the freedom of information. So now I have published data on what a grill would use. So if they don't have the money to go out and do some expensive monitoring at the moment, with times being so tight, I can provide for free a load of data on this particular grill or these particular hobs, so they can start to have a look. And certainly if I can turn the tool that I developed into a more sexy, sophisticated piece of software, then there will be facility for them to think, well, we serve this food. What is the lowest template kitchen that we can come up with to get this out of the door? To really relate food to energy for the first time, really.
And if I was you on day one, what would you be telling me now?
Oh, goodness me. I think that it's the monitoring side of things is so important that it's hard at the time to think of what the return on investment would be at installing loads of meters and getting over all of the calibration problems and the inevitable nightmares of where's that data coming from. But an early doors good survey with some metering that will pay back, even if you can't put a financial amount on it. It will certainly pay back in possibly avoiding the insanity of going round and round in circles calculating it all. So I'd say I was lucky enough on day one that the team had already set about installing AMR in the entire Mitchells and Butlers estate. But certainly it is worth the money to then be able to effectively measure any appliance and technology change, but also even the behavior change. You can really engage people by having them see that their own data hourly or every evening or just every week on a report. So I'd certainly say monitor the hell out of absolutely everything.
Measure.
Yeah.
Sam, I could listen to your story all day. That's the third time I've heard that story. Absolutely awesome. You've done a brilliant job there, and I hope it does continue and there's more to come out of it. I sort of relate to a lot of that. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today and sharing that story. We are going to share your website again on our our links, etc. This goes out and we share your LinkedIn. So people, please go and connect with Sam on LinkedIn and sort of ask her the questions that we need to know. So Sam, thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to say, just lastly, you and your family, please be safe in these times.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.